righty. Welcome to this edition of At the Mic. I'm your host, Keith Malinak. Boy, I cannot wait for today's show. This is going to be great. But as always, bear with me as I retweet this over on the live stream. Boom. All right. So now everyone can find us. Okay. Very cool. Oh, boy. It's another Thursday afternoon deep dive. Again, as I said, I'm your host, Keith Malinak, and I appreciate you making time here today. I will say that it's been 3 months since we've been doing the deep dive on Thursday afternoons. Obviously, we have the Friday live stream, which is kind of fun, but on Thursdays, we tackle more long form issues and just have a conversation about one topic specifically. And it's honestly it's what's ever on my mind. It's a lot of it is what's in your minds as well, because you reach out with some great ideas. And oh my gosh, the stack of stuff. I've showed you the table before that's out of control of topics that we need to get to, and I think we will eventually get to everything that's on your mind. That's the goal. But when I did start this Thursday afternoon deep dive show, I knew I would be challenging myself on certain topics. Otherwise, what's the point? And I always knew in the back of my mind that September 11th, 2001 was going to be a topic someday. And that someday is today. And I will say that when that tragic event happened, I was 25 years old. I was a talk radio producer in Houston, Texas. And I will level with you. I believed everything that the Bush administration was saying. I believed the government narrative as the official story. But now I'm older, and I don't know that I'm wiser, but it's 23 years later. I'm almost 50 years old. And while I don't know everything, not by a long shot, I do know that the federal government is not to be trusted. When there is a major event, the bigger the event, the less likely the government is telling you the truth. And you may personally have questions about the events on September 11th, 2001. I know I do. And since I don't know everything, I want to talk to people who have a different perspective on the events of that day. Now, these are people that maybe 23 years ago I would have vehemently disagreed with. And now I want to listen and hopefully learn and get a different perspective than what I pigeonholed myself into 23 years ago. And asking questions about September 11th, 2001, that takes nothing away from the innocent victims of that day. And that takes nothing away from our military heroes that were sent to the other side of the planet for justice. And it is in our nature as Americans to ask questions, especially questions of our government, and especially the hard ones. So, without further delay, I want to introduce you to a man who goes by the handle Foundring1 over on X. He is a very talented guy. I discovered him years ago during the pandemic, as a matter of fact, because he incorporates incredible talent of ragtime piano. I'm not going to bring him up here yet because I don't want to embarrass him as I'm giving you all the compliments and stuff. But he's so talented, a ragtime piano player. You know what I actually describe it as? It's like a very biting editorial cartoon in song, and there are no sacred cows. Just like on this show, there are no sacred cows, and nothing is off limits. And he really lets politicians and the elites have it in his songs. And I would highly recommend you follow him right now at Foundring1. He possesses a brain that thinks critically. He's a professional Scrabble player. That's awesome, man. He's memorized every word, 9 letters or less in the Scrabble dictionary, which is right up there with like a Webster's dictionary. I mean, this guy's intense. He's a record holder for solving anagrams like in record time. So I just want to give you an idea of how he uses his brain. And I recently saw a tweet thread of his about 9/11, questioning the narrative. And I said, that's who I want to talk to. I want to talk to him. So I'm going to bring him up here right now. Uh, Foundring one. Don't forget to go and follow him if you aren't already. I want to hear what he has to say. And I told him, uh, take as much time as you need. And it's very likely, the odds are high that we are not going to cover every aspect today. And he might have to come back for a second or third or fourth. I have no idea, because the questions could go on forever, I feel. But anyway, I'll stop babbling here. And as I promised you, I'm going to turn this over to you. Thanks for making time today, man. I really appreciate it.
Oh, well, Jesus, my pleasure. Thank you for having me on to talk about this. I'm a fan of your work as well, so it's cool to. It's just weird that all these people that I have been following over the years now, they're like, "Oh, I saw your song," and I'm like, it's humbling and also inspiring too. So
Well,
it
you're
just
absolutely,
through it all, we can still reach people
man.
through all the noise. So signal,
That,
not
yeah,
noise, is a good
yeah.
philosophy.
And I'm telling you, man, you and I are kind of very similar in that I love how you take what's kind of in my head, whether it's Dr. Fauci or fill in the blank, and then you take your talent in music, and it's some of the greatest commentary, social
Well,
commentary,
I
and
like to bring this up a lot, and I hope I don't overdo it, but it's the court jester effect phenomenon, right? No, and
yes.
there's something to be said about the importance of maintaining that court jester, and there's a reason why the king wanted it, right? The court jester was the only dude that could actually make fun of the king to his face with no repercussions, and then
And he
once
wouldn't even
he
realize
couldn't
it.
do that anymore, that's when you knew your society was in trouble, right? He's the pressure valve for the masses, and that's what we hold that mirror up and present it back in the most absurd way possible, and it gets
That's well
people
said.
to
Yeah.
step back, and narratives that are assumed to be totally normal that are actually absurd, like the emperor is naked, he's not wearing any clothes. You need someone to sing a song about it sometimes, about
Yeah.
how that dude is just super naked, and then all of a sudden that spell can get broken, and that one kid comes out and says he's not wearing any clothes. So it's a really important job, I think. Maybe I'm just tapping
No,
myself
no, no,
self on
no,
where is it. You need to
no.
have it,
That's
and that's why I kind of went with that irreverent approach to that. And it's been done before. I mean, Tom Lehrer would be the guy that I would mention from the 50s and 60s. He's a piano player, songwriter,
mhm,
very sarcastic, sardonic approach, very
yeah.
talented. He would look you right in the eye and sing about how your entire reality construction is just doesn't make any sense, and have a
Mhm.
smile about it. And it's
That's
just,
right.
I don't know, it's fun.
No, I agree completely, and you kind of adopt that same thing where you're just staring right at the camera. Your fingers are over here working, and you're just like, "Yep, that's what I'm saying." Before I turn you loose, though, I want to do one last thing here. I wrote out on a little whiteboard here, as I want to do on occasion, and I want to see what you think about how I have this laid out. Now, you can pick up your presentation wherever you want to on the scale. But I was sitting here thinking before we got started, I just I wrote it out like this. This is what I'm going to call the 9/11
You-
conspiracy scale.
You're like
Okay.
Charlie from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia when he's pointing to the board in the background. He's like, "Look, look, look."
You know what? I've been told that before,
No, it's
actually.
okay. I
That's
meant that
so
as a
funny you said
compliment, though.
that.
I mean,
That is hilarious. And I haven't watched that show, but it was my oldest daughter who loves that show. Made that same comparison. Okay, so I think if you start here, right? I could never be a weatherman. You accept the government official narrative, right? I mean, that's where I think the vast majority of Americans lived back in 2001, myself included. But then when you start looking at World Trade Center 7, you're like, okay, wait, there's a lot of questions here. This makes no sense whatsoever. That really opens the door to your mind to say, okay, if they're lying to me about this World Trade Center Building 7, then what else are they lying about? And then I guess the next step, roughly speaking, is the government knew that it was going to happen and allowed it to happen. I mean, that's a dark place right there. But then it gets even darker if you get to the next elevation here, and that's the government took down the towers themselves. All right. Well, now in recent years, the last couple of years, I've seen a lot of presentations. I've seen these presentations about direct energy weapons. And they really started to, I guess, in the last year, because of Maui and all the talk around the fires there, then people started entertaining that maybe DEWs were used on 9/11. Could it possibly be? And that's my segue into you, because that was a large part of that tweet thread that caught my eye a few weeks back and made me reach out to you to try to schedule this. And I thought, okay, you know what? It's no longer just a talk around Maui. It's no longer presentations from strangers that I'm watching on the internet. Now it's a guy who I'm familiar with, enjoy his work, like him. We've conversed before, and that was before I was doing this podcast. And so now I thought, you know what? I'm going to have somebody I know make the case. So now I promise I'm finally done talking, and I will probably come up with questions along the way, as will people in the chat. You are encouraged to write them on there, and we will get to everything all in due course. And like I said, it may take 5 episodes. I have no idea. Maybe we'll get it all covered today. Foundring 1, take it away, sir.
I wasn't trying to make fun of you for the chart or your little graphics. That's
Oh,
actually
no,
great.
no.
That is a great way to kind of visualize these things, because
Yeah,
sometimes it just becomes a little bit much, and your progression of how we all look. These events are emotional experiences that we all share
Absolutely they are.
collectively, as with the whole collective consciousness has this experience. And then everyone, at least in the previous generation, has the, oh, I remember where I was when JFK was shot, right? My dad would always let, he was in 3rd grade and the teacher came in. He has this imprinted into his memory, and bless his heart, for so many years he refused to consider that there was anything nefarious that day, because he was given an official story so fast, and
Yep.
in this heightened state of emotional rawness and impressionability, something becomes hardwired, encoded into our brain. It becomes that much more difficult to unravel, right? So the same thing happened on 9/11, right? So I had the benefit, I guess, of being 10 years younger. I was 15 on 9/11, and it was old enough, and I was, full of myself, and piano player, and I just started dating my second girlfriend the day before, so I was all high and mighty. I'm like, yeah, like I'm big kid on campus, and so I was interested in girls and piano playing at the time, right? As of course any 15-year-old, right? But I had yet to fully form a worldview for myself in terms of what was actually going on. Grown up seemed kind of weird, and I didn't really trust them. I had just lived through, I came to political awareness during the Monica Lewinsky Clinton saga. So that was my introduction to American politics. I'm like, okay, this is pretty messed up. And then the 2000 election happened between, was it Gore and Bush, right?
Gore and Bush,
and that lasted for a month at least of craziness. And I, as a kid, I'm like, holy cow, the grown-ups really don't know what's happening here.
No, we don't, right?
And that resolved, and it just felt so wrong. And I was living in California in a very Democrat liberal area, and I was not a Bush fan, but I was also not, I was like, Clinton was an asshole. Like I was completely disillusioned as a young teenager might be, right, with the system. And then of course 9/11 happens. And I think, and this kind of gets to the larger topics that we're going to talk about today. I was in a place where I was not going to be able to be imprinted, whereas young children wouldn't necessarily remember, and then older people might have, unless they were already kind of looking into Waco and Ruby Ridge and all these things that had been happening progressively and throughout the 90s. Well, earlier, but particularly heating up in the 90s, which I had no concept of as a kid. I mean, I saw the O.J. Simpson trial. I saw that, and I was like, this is weird too, but I didn't have an idea of something else was darker kind of was happening.
And can I just say for a second there, you mentioned Bush. I honestly believe, speaking for myself and other people that maybe are on the right politically, I mean, this happened, and Bush was a hero, and how could we say that our guy had anything, any foreknowledge, anything to do with this, and there was maybe that mental block on the right that maybe in hindsight we look back and we go, "Oh crap, no, there's a lot of
So
questions
I
here that
would
we need
say
to
it's
address."
not just the right. So I was at a
Mhm.
quite a liberal high school, left-leaning high school, and I put up signs questioning Bush, and they were removed, whereas other signs were
Wow.
allowed. So there was calls being made, and even what in my area, like you couldn't question anything, right? I mean, I wasn't even questioning. Right? So let me back up. I will say on 9/11, I knew so I got on the bus in the morning. We heard that the towers had been hit. I wasn't sure if it was the first or second. And then by the time I got off the bus, news that the Pentagon had been hit.
Wow.
And we can discuss about the lack of debris and whether or not a plane hit that. And that's a whole rabbit hole that a lot of people have gone down, and I'm not really going to do. But I will say that my first impression was there is no way that the best US defense system airspace in the world would have been attacked one time, had a period of time pass, and then another attack would be allowed on the most. So as a 15-year-old who knew nothing about anything, that my first impression was something was very wrong. And that either then we're going to be all blown up everywhere, or so we weren't being told the truth. And then of course we got to get to my classroom, and they wheel in the old TV, the old CRT screen, the old VHS, right? And they put on the news, and then what do we see? We see Bin Laden's face immediately on the screen. I had no idea who this dude
Immediately.
was immediately. And I'm like, there's no way they know who did this quickly and gave it to the news stations. And then you can get into the further of the conspiracy rabbit hole when the BBC had put a picture of Building 7, which came down later that day at around 4 or 5 p.m., right? Hours later.
Yeah.
And they said, oh,
Mhm.
Building 7, the
Yeah.
Solomon building, it was called the Solomon building. It has fallen. And yet in the background of the news broadcaster, it's still standing. So they were given a script essentially. And you could say, oh, this was one mistake. And here's the rub when it comes to talking about any of these multifaceted, very confusing, chaotic events. You can mention this anomaly and this anomaly, and people will be like, yeah, okay, coincidence here, coincidence here. And you get to 100 anomalies, and then most will just shut down. Whereas I'm a pattern guy, right? You mentioned the words, right? I like to see all the word where everything works. This combination of letters works. This combination of letters is a fake word. I'm challenging you, right? So I have to be able to discern between the bullshit and the what's real, right? And in the land of Scrabble, that's very important because part of it is bluffing and being like, maybe they don't know this word. Well, if we know the word, we know the word, right? And so at a certain point, the amount of coincidences become too difficult to bear. And
Yeah.
it becomes hard when trying to wake people up about certain things. Even if you don't have the answers, you can be like, oh, here's this and this and this. And most don't really have the time and the energy to sit down and do the Charlie Sunny in Philadelphia meme board and write it out because
Right.
they
Right.
got lives and I get that. But
Exactly. We're too busy. And can I just jump in here real quick and just say, and I said this at the onset, a lot of people, when you question the official narrative, they immediately get defensive. They think you're being disrespectful of the people that died that day. Or maybe it's that they think they get angry because they have that little bit of doubt that maybe they don't know the
oh, it's a
100%
doubt.
truth.
It's a doubt.
and
But
and and you know what, that really bugs me that I was lied to by my government. And in fact, it should anger you even more so at your government if they lied at any aspect of this thing. If you just mentioned 100 inconsistencies, let's say that the government is responsible for one of those, that should make you mad in of itself right there, that they weren't 100% true with us. And so I think what it does is it changes your perspective like that. And it changes hard, man, especially when you have to admit that, you know what, maybe I was lied to, maybe I believed some lies along the way. How many lies? Who knows? People can decide for themselves, but I am looking forward to talking to you and all of the audience about
so
this
your
topic.
your point about how even if there was one thing that was actually a nefarious mistake and then a 99 actual mess ups, that's still important, right? And I can say there's a strong parallel to modern events, even with what happened with Trump back in Pennsylvania last month, about all these different mistakes, and maybe that some were for genuine, but at a certain point, even a mistake is. So the 9/11, there's a lot of parallels there with how many oversights, how many mistakes, how many convenience timed
I'm
events,
looking forward to
particularly with
having
some of the
that
drills and
that
military
discussion.
war game exercises that were happening that day, which
Yeah, yeah,
is
and
a
you
key.
you mentioned July 13th and Trump. That's going to be a whole nother show one day
Yeah,
on this podcast.
we're still putting the pieces of that
Okay,
together for
yeah.
sure.
Where do you want to begin
So,
with September 11th?
well, that's what I'm here right now with the war games and
Oh,
the
okay,
events that
okay.
are happening there, right? So, and I just wanted to expand what you were saying about how it becomes difficult for people to revisit. You can't understate the importance of what I would call the ritual aspect of these events. And I know that word, it can be a turnoff for a lot of people, and they're like, "Oh, are you talking about occult stuff? Are you talking about satanic stuff? Are you talking? What do you mean by ritual?" Well,
Hmm.
even the JFK assassination had a ritualistic killing of the king type of energy behind it. And when you have an event like 9/11 that is it is implanted into the consciousness like that, it is a very traumatic event. And people are given a official story, which is why we are given official stories. Oh, lone gunman, like so quickly. But even
Hmm.
before it's even possible, the facts came in. So that story can be imprinted on your brain, your
Yes,
mind, and
yes.
then you sort of are able to mitigate some of the trauma that is a totally natural human reaction to these events. And unpacking that official narrative is basically PTSD for a lot of people. Maybe you're not in a war, but it brings back the fear and that trauma and that terror of the terror attack, right? Terrorism. That's what this is, and that is why it's so effective to have these official events given so quickly, so that people have such a hard time
Yeah.
calling into question anything, and then they'll shut down. Like mentioned, my dad for years, he would not entertain any discussions about the JFK assassination. I'll be giving him books. He says, no, 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 official story. And he's since kind of walked that back a little
Mhm.
bit, but it might take 30, 40 years. And here we are 25 years almost after 9/11, and we're still having these discussions with hushed voices,
Yeah,
which is just wild.
and let's remember, part of the psychological game that the government plays with us is the term itself, conspiracy theorist,
Oh,
which
yes.
was born out of the post JFK. If you doubted the narrative, then you were obviously fringe of society, and you didn't even deserve the time of day. But you mentioned the war games happening around 9/11. Explain what was happening specifically on that day.
So basically, you had a series of very complex, multi-organizational events that were simulating attacks in the air. They were simulating cyber attacks. Uh, I'm gonna before I name them and discuss them in detail. It's really tricky when talking about this 9/11, and you get to, oh, the government did it, or who this government other here did it. This is we're dealing with a multi-layered, multifaceted event, right? And there are terms that are used for what you made on your happy little board, which I love, that emerged early on in the 9/11 research. So I started doing a deep dive into 9/11 early, like 2003,
Oh
2004.
wow, good for
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
Okay.
So, well, I was someone put a pamphlet on my car when I was about 16 or 17. I just started driving, and around 2002 or 3, and it had a bunch of websites linked on it. And I went to them and I found a whole bunch. So thank you to whoever did that. It started me on the path, but I wasn't immediately like, oh, the government did it. And
Mhm.
still, it's such a simplistic view. It's again way more complex. So you have this theory of the let it happen on purpose called the lie hop, right?
Oh,
You have,
it's
I
got a
guess,
word.
yes, what's that?
It's got a word?
It's got a word
Lie?
for it. Yeah, lie hop, right? Let it happen
Okay.
on purpose. So you have the
Okay.
official narrative you there on the left, right? Yeah, that's the official narrative is
Mhm.
just that the hijackers did it, and they managed to outsmart the best defense system in the whole world. And they did incredible maneuvers, like that pilot who allegedly hit the Pentagon did this incredible turn, and it was just whatever. So, okay, that is a possibility. I will grant it in the grand scheme of things. And the 9/11 Commission, they got it right. And Building 7 just happened to fall in its footprint. Sure, I will accept that is a possibility. And incredibly, that's what a lot of people believe still. Then you have the let it happen on purpose, which kind of emerged early on, which was, okay, wow, we have apparently the FBI was tracking a lot of these hijackers. They were partying before, they're not supposed to be these religious, but no, they were actually getting hookers and doing drinking and stuff. And then, oh wait, they're in the same building as some of these FBI field offices, and they're training at these places. So all this stuff is like, okay, maybe that these guys were being watched and a drill. So just to back up a little bit, a lot of people forget, I certainly didn't remember because I wasn't old enough at the time, but the World Trade Center complex was attacked in the 90s. Are you aware of this? Before
yes,
there was
I
the bombing,
was getting a haircut
right?
that day, as a matter of fact.
Okay, so
because just like you said, you remember where you were,
right?
And I
what did we find out about that? Was that it was the FBI that urged this person, basically gave him the materials for the bomb, had him cook the bomb, and fortunately, it wasn't a bigger event, but that was an early on example of grooming a terrorist, essentially. And maybe they were going to stop him at the right moment. Well, it didn't. Something went wrong, and then people ended up getting killed. But what it did was it put into our consciousness the notion that the World Trade Center was a target for terrorism, which, again, less than 10 years later, what did we see? So,
and keep in mind, FBI whistleblower Steve Friend, when we did our "What's Wrong with the FBI" episode, and we have round 2 with him coming up here on September 12th, as a matter of fact, he told us of a study that shows us that 99% of these domestic terrorist activities, which I assume this would qualify for, by the way, because it happened in the United States, right? I don't think, or maybe that might be. Anyway, bottom line is the fact is that 99% of these would not occur without the FBI's involvement. I mean, that is staggering. So you have to look at this stuff, like you just said, as, well, there's a 99% chance that our government is involved.
They have a storied history of subterfuge. I mean, just look at J. Edgar Hoover and the history of the early FBI and the stuff that they were pulling. And I'm not trying to absolve other agencies and say, oh, it's all, because clearly this is a systemic failure by this bloated behemoth of bureaucracy. Look at my alliteration there. So, okay, but we could talk. Let's get to the drills. So you have the let it happen on purpose people. However, as details emerged over the years, so I know I'm going to try not to keep give myself on tangents here. The timeline of how these events unraveling is happening at an exponentially quicker scale. Whereas with JFK, it took 10 years even for the Warren Commission to start, and that was a whitewash of a thing. And then it took 30 years for that movie JFK before the people started really talking about it. And then even now they still have documents that are, and then we had to rely on Zapruder, and that was taken forever, whatever. 9/11, we're at a similar thing where there weren't enough cell phones, but we have a lot more pictures. There's a lot more photo evidence so that we can analyze. And then now, what do we see with events like in Pennsylvania? It's been a month and we have full analyses. We have suspects that are possible. We have all this cell phone footage, new stuff every day. So the timeline of these things unraveling has totally changed, and they've had to change the nature of these events. So for 9/11, when we were still piecing everything together, it was kind of harder to tell how convoluted the whole narrative was. But the problem with the let it happen on purpose is that these hijackers must have had access to, they timed this event on the best day possible. So in other words, either somebody was feeding them information within our system, or they basically won the lottery. They chose the day. So I will now start talking about these games, right? I think Webster, Griffin, Tarpley, researchers, the first to bring this to broader attention. And there was an event called, or a war game exercise called Global Guardian. And basically it involved the entire strategic nuclear and thermonuclear arsenal of the United States. ICBMs, SLBMs, nuclear bombers, the Doomsday Looking Glass command posts. It involved the air bases that house hydrogen bombs, which were in Barksdale in Louisiana, and in Offutt base in Omaha, Nebraska. And Bush ended up flying to both of those bases, which is very important and not as often discussed, about why he actually had to be there. I'm trying to read. So,
oh yeah, Anthony, we'll get to that. Hurricane talk.
So on the morning before a single hijacking had been reported, the U.S. had assumed a strategic nuclear posture comparable to that observed during the Cuban Missile Crisis. B-1 and B-52 bombers were in the air, ballistic missile submarines were at their launch points, presumably near Russia and possibly China, and land-based ICBMs were ready for launch. The air defenses of North America were on high alert in terms of interceptor aircraft and space assets. Everything, in short, was ready for a nuclear-first strike. All of this was observed in real time from Moscow by General Leonid Ivashov and his colleagues of the Russian General Staff. And in a highly significant move, Bush's flight itinerary on 9/11 included both of the nuclear bases in Offutt. So, also what was happening was a cyber attack drill was happening on the Stratcom computer network. So all of these things had essentially never happened at one time. They were all occurring on the morning of 9/11. And what did you see was you saw all these fighter pilots, and we have their audio their discussions where they were saying, oh, we have a hijacked plane. And they're saying, is this real or is this drill? Everything is confused because they were all dealing with a system of hijacked planes. And what's interesting is they say, oh, we never would have, the official story, we never could have thought that planes would be flown into buildings in New York. They had actual literal TV shows. For example, the show The Lone Gunman, which was produced by the same guys as X-Files, ran a pilot earlier that year in 2001 of terrorists hijacking a plane to fly into the World Trade Centers to start a war in the Middle East. Okay. So all these things, and then people have done entire documentaries on all the pre-programming of, and sure, there were well-known monuments, and obviously you could imagine a terrorist attack against them in any scenario. So that's not what's unusual. But what is unusual is just all of these events surrounding it. How did the government, how did all these agencies happen to do all these drills that mimicked, essentially had them ready for what happened, which was essentially a nuclear attack on U.S. soil, and how it basically someone flipped the switch to make it go live? So less reported than the events on, I mean, people know about the anthrax and stuff that happened after, but actually there was a series of cyber attacks and threats. The guy he's a French guy, Thierry Meyssan is his name. He, over the next 2 days, September 12th and 13th, there was reported, Bush's press secretary, Ari Fleischer, reported that the Secret Service had additional threats, and the White House and Air Force One were targets, and they had the codes of the DEA, the National Reconnaissance Office, the NRO, Air Force Intelligence, AFI, Army Intelligence, AI, Naval Intelligence, NI, the Marine Corps Intelligence, MCI, and the intelligence services of the State Department and the Department of Energy. Now, each of these codes would not be given to one person. They were very compartmentalized. However, and this is a whole nother can of worms, there's a computer software called PROMIS, PROMIS, all one, like all capital letters in acronym. And it was used to create a lot of these agencies and the codes that were involved in that. So if you had a backdoor to this PROMIS computer software, you might be able to basically infiltrate the entire US government. So what we saw on 9/11 was an infiltration in a big way of the entire command structure of a coup would be another way to put it. Now, there's a lot of infighting in the 9/11 truth movement over the years about oh, what, like Cheney was involved, and or this country was involved, Israel did it, China was involved too, and so all these things might be part of the equation. The CIA, the Mossad had presence there. I do, I appreciate and entertain all these notions, but honestly, they distract from the important questions that need to be asked that day. First of which is, where did the towers go, in which we can start delving into. But the second one is, who was responsible for this massive failure of our security system? Why did our leaders react the way they did? Why was Cheney essentially whisked away into the secure bunker of the White House? There was a fire reported in the White House that day. What's up with that? Why did the Pentagon, why did Donald Rumsfeld announce $2 trillion missing from the budget the day before? Of course, that gets debunked, but he really did do that. And then that area of the Pentagon was hit. Why was the areas, why was
again?
The
part of the Pentagon, the accounting wing, right?
The accounting. And so
this was hit.
He basically, he said that there was this amount of money missing. Now, the fact checkers love to say, oh, it was referring to this and this and this, and had nothing to do with 9/11. But I'm sorry, he announced it the day earlier. And here's another thing. I'm going to drop a little hint here about the occult ritual aspect of this. Was 11 years to the day before 9/11. So on September 11th, 1990, George Bush Sr., president, gave a speech at the United Nations where he invoked the need for a new world order. And it is famously referred to as the New World Order speech. And it just so happened to happen 11 days to the day on September 11th before 9/11. I know that speech.
I didn't realize it was delivered on September 11th, 1990.
Years. And then, of course, you can talk about the Project for the New American Century, which was a neocon think tank. Wolfowitz, Cheney, all those guys, Rumsfeld, they got together and they said, we need basically a galvanizing Pearl Harbor type event, and it will spawn a whole new decade or a generation of American imperialism. That's just basically what they were saying. And of course, they would never have convinced America to go along with that without a catalyzing event like a 9/11. So I get it. The neocons have their hands all over it. And even the neo-libs, the Clinton types, they, of course, were this is all the uniparty, right? However, it starts to break down a little bit. Like, I feel like I can imagine Cheney sitting there being like, yes, do it, bring down the towers. And the Larry Silverstein saying, yes, give me that insurance money. I think we're dealing with a far more powerful faction here. So I'm going to get to what I would call the 3 layers of 9/11. And I actually have a book that is good for that. I'm going to hold up.
Yep. Stay hydrated. I mean, this is...
Yes. I mean, I could forget. So it's called Hidden Finance, Rogue Networks, and Secret Sorcery. It's by a guy named Joseph Farrell. And he's not the first to come up with the 3 layers of 9/11. I think Webster Tarpley was the first to bring it up, but he really breaks it down. What do I mean by the 3 layers of 9/11? 3 planning layers. The first, the lowest, maybe you can call it the 3rd layer, the bottom layer, would be the Muslim extremists, the hijackers, these people who were real individuals. Now, there are some that would say, oh, they weren't actually flying those planes, or they were something else happened there. But these were real individuals. They famously found their passports, or at least one of their passports, right, was found in the rubble of 9/11. And yet we're going to talk about this. There was no filing cabinets were found. One toilet was found. Like, the destruction was so complete that everything was pulverized. But, oh, we can read his passport. So all these things are just, okay, throw it in the coincidence file. They don't prove anything, which is why I tend to not beat people over the head with, oh, look, they found it. And be like, okay, 1 in a million chance, I guess it's possible. So these things are important, but they're not crucial for the narrative. So you have the lowest level guys, and these even could be dudes putting bombs in the buildings as well, or putting nanothermite in the building, which is a tool that is claimed to have been maybe used to help bring down the towers. Got it. So these are the low level grunts. You have the second layer. Now, these would be the guys that are the government officials. And even the Cheneys might not even be at the top of the second layer, right? He could be, those factions in the government could be. And they would be the let it happen / made it happen on purpose, helping time things maybe with the drills. They would know that drills would be that day. Whether or not they knew that the towers would be destroyed in the manner that they did is a whole different question, right? Now you get the first level, first layer. This would be the ones that actually pulled a coup on the US government that day. Not to say that we haven't been compromised for a while, but this was, I would say, post World War II, there was a marriage of convenience between us and this sort of supranatural organization, or supranational, I should say supernatural too, but supranational. So not outside of any nation state, there would be a post-war organization that could combine elements of extreme fascism, extreme communism, extreme Zionism. All these guys, they merge in my mind. I'm trying not to confuse things in the discussion too much. Figuring out who is, we got to figure out what first, before we got to figure out what happened that day before we can say, oh, you did it and you did it and you did it, right? I just want to look at that day. What were the events? Who went where? So somebody blackmailed the government over the next few days as well with this. We have all of your agencies compromised. We know all the secret codes to access them. We've hacked your back end to your system. Where was Bush on 9/11? He was in Florida, happened to be 10 miles away from Venice. Where was Venice, Florida? That's where one of the hijackers was training at. It's kind of an interesting coincidence. He's sitting there reading to a bunch of school kids, My Pet Goat or something, The Pet Goat, whatever. He gets told, interestingly, the guy who takes the picture as he's finding out is the same guy who happens to take the bullet shot of the bullet that whizzed by Trump, the 1 in a million shot where he was able to capture that bullet going by. Same photographer is in that classroom. Now, sure, you can say, oh, he's just a regime presidential photographer. Well, no, they were there to capture these important moments for our consciousness. So Bush says, oh, I'm going to go back to DC, but doesn't. He goes to Offutt and he goes to the 2 nuclear bunkers. And you have some very interesting people there. You have Warren Buffett's there. High-level generals are there. These are basically the nuclear command centers of the country. And what people theorize is a coup had essentially happened, and Bush was had to go to the nuclear command centers personally, where he gave a speech at one of them to reassert his command, giving his own, basically a continuity of government had been enacted at that moment, which basically means we are going to keep things functioning no matter what happens. And another often not discussed thing is that Bush had a phone call with Putin on 9/11, and is said to have expressed the desire to go to war in Afghanistan, and Putin gave the green light for this, probably because he knew Russia had already done that, and it screwed them and basically killed the Soviet Union. And here you have Bush about to make the same mistake. And another very interesting thing are the finances of the fall of the Soviet Union, and there was a project called Project Hammer that was surrounded that. And a lot of that financial stuff about basically we looted our intelligence agencies, the Soviet money exchange supply during the fall. And it was one big op. It was called Project Hammer. And a lot of that financial stuff was in the basement of the Twin Towers. And also, a lot of these events are surrounded by weird financial stuff. So the stock market, there were what are called puts put on these certain airlines, on American Airlines, in wildly, bizarre. And similar stuff happened with JFK stuff, and also similar stuff with what we would call security stripping, where they took away important security measures. We saw it on 9/11. We saw it when they pulled off security guys on the JFK, they chose a different route that they weren't supposed to. They didn't check the buildings. And we, again, saw a group of Secret Service in Trump in Pennsylvania that were not supposed to be there. They were not the regular folks. And we saw examples of this, what we would call security stripping. So that leaves us with an event that is multifaceted with multiple layers of players, essentially. And I think that you have that layer 2 of the neocon Cheney types expecting one thing to happen, and then something else ended up happening, which was someone else took this already planned event that they knew about, and they were like, let's show that marriage of convenience between the U.S. juggernaut. 2001 was a divorce. This was this organization with access to high levels of technology, debuting it, but in a way that was more like a muscle flex. I mean, you could say, oh, well, this was extremely destructive, blah, 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 blah. If whoever did this at the highest level wanted to maximize damage, they got it the opposite. They got it completely wrong. They were able to remove 2 of the biggest skyscrapers in the world in a highly populated area with almost negligible. And I know people are like, oh, it's destroyed so much. Is it? How much energy and material and mass that was in those buildings should have obliterated Lower Manhattan, should have flooded it. It should have. Whoever did this did it in a way where it caused the least amount of damage, but in the most spectacular,
right,
extraordinary visually way that was, again, a type of ritual. And we basically see the U.S. acting like a gun to its head, including up to the financial crash of 2008, which I would say is connected to all of this, with how things were done, where we were basically looted, a wealth transfer, again, up through COVID and anything. So I'm going to ask you to bring up these pictures in a moment.
All right. And right before I do that, though, can I just ask you, will you be revealing later, or can you tell us now, who is it that, or maybe you're not asserting an answer at all here, who is it that would have been blackmailing the United States? And furthermore, like, with what, I guess, would be my follow-up on that.
Well, I mean,
I don't want to give it away if it's coming up later.
The what would be, hey, look at what we made 2 skyscrapers disappear.
Okay, so doing that, then okay, I got you. So
but the who
commit that act, and then okay, flex.
That's the
okay,
well, the flex include over the next few days, as they said, we also compromise all of your agencies. But the technology that was done, that was used, was, I believe, a debut of technology, right?
Understood.
So
now. Is that
where did the towers go? Where did the towers go? So.
And this is just so everyone knows, they should sign up for your Substack. That's where they can read this and absorb it at their own pace. If you want to give, and I can maybe make a banner for this, where can they find this if they want to follow along?
Foundring.substack.com. Foundring.substack.com. So I want to preface this by saying, I want everyone to just get along. Why can't we just get along? There's a lot of infighting in a lot of the truth movements, in the 9/11 truth movement, and people are quick to, and I'm bad because I'm going to do this in my presentation, but call, hey, you're an agent, or you're a deep state, or whatever, and I just roll my eyes at. Like, I want to talk about not the personalities, but just the material itself. So early on, bombs in the building was a thing, right? And it's still, I think that there is a lot of evidence that certain types of bombs were planted. Barry Jennings was a witness who reported on the floor level of bombs going off. And I remember I found out about him in 2007, and I started sharing about, I was like, check out Barry Jennings. And he died mysteriously, right? Like the week later, I'm like, oh, okay, this is crazy. So there's a lot of evidence that that is true, that there are things like that. The thermite theory, for those who aren't aware, that it's a special type of material where this government weapons grade thermite basically can cut through steel. You have the whole meme of, oh, jet fuel can't melt steel beams, right? Well, the heat of the heat of the planes wouldn't be enough to melt all the foundations, yada yada yada. So you have the thermite people, and the thermite people came out early and said, oh, well, this could be. They found, oh, this residue of what could be thermite. Now, I'm not one to say that thermite wasn't used either. And the thermite people would argue with the bomb people and whatever. And so I will say, and I can go into more detail later, that the gentleman who's behind the thermite theory first is a guy named Dr. Stephen Jones. And I can confirm that he does have connections with government agencies, and that he is not to be trusted. And I have my reasons for that. So I think that him pushing the thermite theory is a big cause for suspect. Now, you have another kind of theory, which is that there were nukes in the buildings, special types of nukes. There's a Russian guy, I can't remember his name, that talks about it. This is just trying to come up for the unconventional destruction of material that we saw. But there are some issues with the nuke theory, in particular, the lack of seismic recordings and seismic data that we have that would come with a nuke, lack of radiation and other issues, right? And then the fourth, I would say, would be what we would call the direct energy weapon hypothesis. Now, direct energy weaponry it's such a loaded term, even just like conspiracy theory. Can mean so many things and refer to, so it's a whole class of stuff. You can go to Wikipedia. It's got a whole page on it. Our own government has admitted that the existence of these. There are a lot of different types. People say that Tesla was experimenting with some of this stuff. A guy named Tom Bearden in the 80s started talking about what we call scalar weapons. The guy whose book I showed, Joseph Farrell, talks about what he would call torsion scalar weaponry. I don't have a degree in structural engineering or physics or anything. I'm a piano ragtime Scrabble nerd, right? So I have read books on this. I have done deep dives into the work of Thomas Townsend Brown, T.T. Brown, who discovered a phenomenon called electrogravitics in the 1920s, started working with the government. It's basically where he was able to combine electricity and magnetism to create a local gravitational effect, a lift. And now they try to debunk and say, oh, this is ion winds or anything, but these were replicated by French and our own government in the 40s and 50s, doing it underwater where there could be no wind and other things. So there is a local effect here with gravity. So there's something going on with relativity, and Einstein's version of gravity is not right, and that you don't need giant objects to affect gravity. You can do it locally under the certain circumstances. And so you see, Boeing was experimenting with anti-gravity technology, and then in the 50s, everything went dark. And by the 60s, they say, oh, it's all, by dark, I mean classified programs, all went black, like black projects, right? So they started developing this stuff. And we saw in 1947, I think, the creation of the CIA. And also an important event was Roswell. And Roswell, of course, was that UFO that landed. What's interesting about that is the narrative of that one has changed over the years, where there wasn't even talk about alien bodies and everything for at least 10, 15 years, where initially they were like, oh, it's a weather balloon. But the government was actually putting out initial reports that this was a secret a project that went down. And so what we're looking at, in my opinion, from the research I've done, is some state, not our own, using this technology. Now, this is not alien ship from like Pluto or wherever. This is a post-war entity that emerged after 1945 that was experimenting with this type of different flight technology. Okay. Now, fast forward to 9/11, where we have been experimenting with this type of direct energy weapons. The government has only come out within the last 10 years and say, okay, yeah, this is real. China's been working on it. They have these space-based lasers. Another issue with this conversation is like, oh, you think space lasers brought down? It's like, no, none of this has anything to do with if these are on satellites, if these are from ground, if these are from whatever, right? This is a HARP did this, right? All these things are immaterial. Sure, eventually it'd be important to know what is going on here. But before we figure out the where of it, we just need to look at the what of it. And so early on, after the thermite and the bomb theory started to come out, you had some other people with degrees, structural engineers people, that came out and said, look, there's something on the day of 9/11. I looked at this and something wasn't right. And I had honestly never really thought about it until I started listening to them. And I realized just how glaring it is in that you had 110, there's that number 11 again, 110, 110-story building collapse basically. And where did it go? Like much of it, and you could say, oh, there's dust everywhere, and we see giant things over here. There are differing opinions to the weight, but a higher estimate that is often said is 500,000 tons, 500,000 tons. This is a massive amount of material that, if it hit the ground, would be an enormous seismic reaction, essentially, and would take a long time. Even if you go by their, the pancake model or whatever official models that they have, the whole free fall thing is a bit of a red herring. I mean, with bombs, it would help by eliminating some of the floors underneath, but it would still take time, and it would still leave a bunch of stories. It wouldn't leave an absence of space, essentially. So one of the first people to come out was Judy Wood, who gets a lot of bad rap, I think, in the community, the 9/11 research community. She's the one who wrote this book. She's heavily credentialed. This book you can find it online for free if you look on the Internet Archive. I would encourage people, because we can't trust the internet anymore. Try to get a copy of this. They're about $50. It's a tome. It's a textbook. It's a piece of history. I really defy anyone to actually read this front to back, cover to cover, and then not come away and say there's something here. And so she doesn't necessarily have any conclusions, which I'm not trying to come here and say this group did it and they used this weapon and it came from HARP or this satellite. That's not what this is about. This is just about, we need to look at all these different things. And if your thermite, your nuclear weapon, your bombs can't explain all of this, there needs to be another explanation. Okay. And yes, it's important to say who did it, why did they do it, who are the competing factions at play. But the nature of what happened is key before you can start talking about, before we can talk about, oh, the government was infiltrated and Cheney didn't know, like all these stuff. We have to at first acknowledge that there was something unusual that happened here. So where did they go? Where did the towers go? I have put these about 40 different, several dozen questions, I would say, or statements about what happened that day. How did they fall so fast? It should not have been it was faster almost than a free fall collapse. We're talking 9-10 seconds it took for them to come down. We can see how they kind of underwent this mid-air pulverization, essentially. The photo evidence shows that. And this number 3 is very important. The bathtub refers to this architectural structure that it was built, that all the World Trade Center complex was built on, and it essentially prevented Lower Manhattan from getting flooded by the Hudson, right? And what should have happened with those two towers collapsing on it? It should have broken the bathtub, and it should have flooded Lower Manhattan, which would have been another disaster of another order of magnitude, right? This would have been a huge, horrible thing, even worse than already what we did. The rail lines, I think 4 out of 7 survived underneath. Crazy. The mall underneath, they had Warner Brothers characters. That's what the Roadrunner refers to. There was a gap. They were all intact. And there are quotes from engineers and architects afterwards saying it's a miracle that this didn't cause more damage and that this didn't just destroy Lower Manhattan, essentially, more than already. I would say the top 3 of the important evidence is the seismic impact, where and of course you could say, oh, well, maybe they gave us inaccurate figures. Well, we have to go with what they gave us. Okay. So
I spent a lot of time on your tweet thread with the King Dome.
So
demolition.
It's important because it's an important one that we have reference to, where that was in Seattle, and it was a number of years before 9/11, and it was a massive structure, but it was only had a fraction of the material that these World Trade Centers had. Okay. And it was also not rooted in the bedrock, right? It was not, that's not the way it was built, right? So if something is implanted in the bedrock and it gets destroyed, it causes a much more of the shaking. So this was in the sort of the soft ground. Regardless, they demolished it, and it came back with, I think, a 3.2 on the Richter scale, which is the data that we have from that event. So we can actually compare this massive demolition of this, and you can see the pictures of it, and I've got them. And the point is, the 2 towers went down at 3.2 and 3.1 on the Richter scale, which is equivalent and even less than the Seattle King Dome. However, they should have had a whole order of magnitude higher. I might have it wrong. It might not be 3, it might be 2, might be 2. That's what it was. It was 2.3. Either way, they were commensurate. They were equal to each other. The amount of seismic readings that we got from both of the twin centers was actually even less than a building that was way smaller and way less material. And to boot, the World Trade Centers were actually in the bedrock, so they should have created even more of a reaction. So the seismic, the bombs don't explain that. Even thermite could weaken things, but you still have all this material that would have to go somewhere and have to hit the ground.
Right. I would imagine that, and again, I'm not scientific. I'm just a layman here. It feels like something gaining velocity, going down 110 stories would have a greater impact as far as seismic readings, as opposed to the King Dome, which I don't know how many stories tall was the Seattle King Dome.
It had about a tenth of the material in it, about 10. Okay. I think it had a fraction of the.
And it would seem like, and again, this is just me just spitballing here, it would seem like that would have a much greater impact on the ground below after gaining that speed coming down, I would guess.
I will just say there are certain anomalies that are glaring to me, and I find it even more interesting that they're almost never discussed. They're almost never mentioned in this. And other than the people that talk about the direct energy weaponry that could have been used, you won't really hear many people saying, oh, the lack of seismic signature. And for even the folks that say the nukes were used, you would have had way bigger of a seismic signature. Even a mini nuke, it's not going to pulverize all this or dustify, as they will say, this material. So they were destroyed. You can see how they were destroyed from the top up, right? The material just disappears before it even hits the ground, which again explains the lack of seismic signature. Even WT7, there are firefighters that are quoted. I didn't even hear that. So remember, World Trade Center 7 was not hit by a plane. There have been only 3 structures that have ever fallen, steel structures, basically into their own footprint in human history. And they were all in one day. 2 of them were hit by a plane. But you can say that the only steel structure in human history that has ever fallen completely without, according to the official story, without getting hit by a plane or bombs or anything, just from fire, is WT7. So whenever someone says that, oh, this is the only time in human history this has ever happened, that's a sign that you need to pay attention, right? So there were firefighters that said it was whisper quiet. Basically, they're saying, we don't even hear it falling, right?
So yeah, and I remember that day on the news, the talk was that first responders and those in the area of World Trade Center 7, they were warned. They said you got to get away from there, because it's about to fall. But that conflicts with point 8 there that
Well, the
says,
famous saying, the poet, he says, the WT Larry Silverstein, who was the owner of the buildings, there's a recording of, he said, oh, and then there was just so much loss of life, so we decided to just pull it. Which pull it is a term for
yeah,
demolition.
right.
Of course, he
Right.
later said, oh, we were saying pull the firefighters out, but you don't. The way that he said it was, no, that's
Right.
not what he was talking
And,
about.
and is it a good place in your presentation to mention what was inside Building 7?
Well, so yeah, you mean all the everything that
Right,
yeah,
right.
it is, and all of this stuff is part of it for sure. But again, I want to. We got to get through this
Okay.
the science aspect of it,
Just stay
right?
with science. Okay, no conjecture.
So
That's fair.
so
Yep.
another, what I mentioned earlier, we couldn't find any filing cabinets for the World Trade Centers. We found one. We couldn't find any toilets. So what we did see was tons of paper, just paper littering the floors, and a lot
That's
of it was
right.
paper not on fire, surrounding cars that were on fire, with trees still with their leaves on. Now, this kind of harkens to the Maui situation, and then also the fires that have taken place, like in Paradise, California, a number of years ago. I'm getting ahead of myself. We saw windows with circular holes in them, which were kind of odd. We saw entire buildings with circular holes in them, which kind of gets to this phenomenon called the Hutchinson effect, which we're going to hit later on when we talk about the hurricane. And we saw lots of weird puffs of fumes that kind of look like smoke, kind of look like wispy fog, coming out of dirt, coming out of the ground. And we also saw them piling dirt for years. They were trucking in dirt and putting it on these areas and then carting out the dirt. And it's the strangest thing. And I think a very important clue to what was actually happening here, that we were dealing with it, essentially an ongoing reaction in the material there, in the beams and everything. For example, the Bankers Trust was kind of hit, but they rebuilt it. But then they ended up tearing the whole thing down and rebuilding it again, which suggests that maybe there was some sort of ongoing reaction. Again, getting ahead of myself. So all these terms, these fuzzy blobs, these are terms that Judy Wood came up with to describe this new phenomena that we fortunately have lots of pictures of. Before the time of cell phones, but certainly enough cameramen were brave enough, and some of them literally sacrificed their lives to get some of this footage, which is, we owe them a deep duty of gratitude, along with one topic which I tend to not discuss because it's pretty intense. And I didn't even bring up in my thing because I want to respect the people, but I will talk about it now. And that is the jumpers on 9/11 have a really, really important story to tell. And we can maybe circle back to that later on. But I think that they are a key part about the story, and that their sacrifice is really important. But I don't have any. They're very important, especially the pictures of them and the pictures of the people on the sides of the buildings. But I don't have any of those in my presentation, just because I want to respect them. Not that I say, oh, don't share them. I don't have a problem with that. But there's so much to be said other than them. But I think that they need to be mentioned because, again, I think they're a part of the story, along with the cameramen who were noble and brave enough to go down and get these really, really crucial importance of right after it happened. Okay. So we also saw, a lot of like analysis has been done in the material after the event, and they're like, oh, this is proof that we found thermite and stuff. Well, no, we saw a breakdown of the molecular constitution of some of this material, and it could be thermite here or whatever. So it could be also the result of a direct energy weapon. Lots of the weird fires we saw cars on fire next to paper, next to trees with leaves on them, people walking in fire. So some of this fire didn't really appear to have very high heat, which would explain why certain things were combusting, like the packs that the firemen had for their air packs, they were exploding. So something else was happening to just the area around them. Lots of paper, the holes, and then I would say probably one of the key, other than the seismic signature and the magnetic readings, which I haven't mentioned yet, would be the toasted cars. And what I mean by toasted, that's a term that is kind of loosely used because it doesn't necessarily refer to heat. But what we saw was extreme rusting, quick rusting of cars, vehicles in the area, some in weird ways and some that were kind of half destroyed and half not. But up to a mile away, we saw this phenomenon, and we saw this cloud go through these cars, and these clouds were not hot because people survived them. No one was reported as being burned or died from any of these rolling clouds that covered people in the streets. That didn't kill anybody. So it wasn't hot, but what it did was it caused mass rusting on a lot of these vehicles. And we have pictures of them on day one, still not rusted. And then over the next few days, full rusting happened. And a lot of these cars were they were carted away. And we have pictures of all that happening. More damage was done to the bathtub by the earth moving equipment during the cleanup process. So again, that bathtub is really important. The fact that it wasn't destroyed. The Twin Tower, it basically didn't really, it hurt other buildings, but it felt, the way they felt only really affected the complex, and nothing really else was destroyed. The fuming that happened, for several years, we saw this weird smoke coming out, and people say, oh, there was moltens of pools of lead. There wasn't. We saw the heat signatures from that area. There was no molten anything. This was not a high heat phenomenon that we were seeing. The rubble pile, it was too small. WTC 1 and 2 were too small to account for the total mass of the buildings. There was a lot of mud, a lot of dirt that was brought in. Toasted cars, the Scott packs. Those are the things that the firemen use. They were combusting in weird ways. The flipped cars, something I don't mention here. A lot of blue cars survived, which blue is a thing that they are now talking about as having a similar frequency that is not affected by some of these weapons. And there's a meme even that Chinese people are painting their roofs blue, and in Maui, some of the blue houses. Well, we saw some of the blue cars survive completely next to cars that weren't. And here I would say is in the top 3 of the importance of something happened here would be the magnetometer readings, particularly in a station in Alaska, but in I think about half a dozen different stations that test magnetic anomalies on the planet. They recorded some really strange things during the fall of the tower. So right then, something happened that affected the whatever, and that was recorded in it. Thermite wouldn't do that. Explosions wouldn't do that. And even a nuclear weapon wouldn't do that. And certainly a conventional collapse wouldn't do that. Something else must have caused that. Now, and here we get to, I think, one of the keys of this whole narrative, and that the amount of energy, assuming that this would be some sort of torsion scalar weapon, to reduce those to pulverize, to dustify 2 buildings of that size would take such unimaginable power. The person wielding it would essentially be God. I mean, not to be blasphemous or anything, but they would have God-like powers, essentially. They would be able to conjure. I mean, it would be like Lex Luthor type, death ray type, just shoot this beam and then, like science fiction. Well, things don't really, the real world doesn't work like that, right? They've been lying to us about gravity and and the fact that we're not in a closed system, we're in an open system. And even things like oil is abiotic, right? In that it can be actually generated by the earth. You don't need to rely on plants and fossils and stuff. So these systems are open systems, right? Well, you can't just conjure up energy like this. It's got to be redirected. So what people might not know about hurricanes is that they exhibit a type of torsion effect that is similar to Tesla coils and this type of energy. And it's been talked about for a long time of, oh, we can steer hurricanes, or we can tap it, we can modify, people talk about HARP and changing the weather. Well, yes, we have, and they admit that we have been able to modify the weather. I mean, heck, China in 2008, before their Olympics, made all the rain stop they admitted to doing this, right? So
Yeah.
governments, and in Vietnam, there's talk about weather manipulation experiments that we were doing in Cambodia and Vietnam. And so this stuff governments have been playing for a long time. So the idea that a hurricane can be maneuvered is not that crazy. It really isn't, especially when you start talking about these HARP type installations. Not saying that was responsible, but what we saw on 9/11 was Hurricane Aaron, which was bigger by most measures than Hurricane Katrina, which did so much damage, and it went on the coast, and you can watch the weather patterns. It just planted itself and got closest to New York City on the Manhattan on the morning of 9/11 before moving this way. And you can see satellite images, even on the day of 9/11, you can see the smoke coming from because those you can see from the satellite. But next to it, zoom back, this massive hurricane structure is just sitting right there.
Close enough to it was raining in Cape Cod, right? I mean, it was close to the coast.
It was so close that it was in this area of a warning. It's supposed to have been a warning to go off that if it had landed, it would have been worse than Katrina. I mean, it would have caused serious devastation. The most interesting thing, I think, is not that it existed at all, is the lack of coverage of it. Mm-hmm. There are news clips that you can find where they kind of mention it, but they should have been Look, the news loves to be crazy, be like, oh, this is good. Oh, they're like fear monger, right? This would have been a perfect opportunity for them to be like, oh my God, the storm of all the ages is coming in. Oh, look, we just barely escaped. Like the material there would have been incredible, but the discussion of Hurricane Aaron was almost non-existent.
And why do you think that is?
Well, it's because
I know on your presentation, you had a lot of weathermen with the forecast that was airing that morning before the towers were hit. And what is your takeaway from that?
Well, I just think most of those people just do what they're told. For example, the BBC reporter who reported that the WT7 building had collapsed 20 minutes before it actually did. She's not in there being like, I am like calling Dick Cheney right now. She's being handed a script to read, and she's told to read that the building had come down, because that's part of the narrative that was supposed to happen that day. It just took a little bit longer, I think, than they thought it might. So these weathermen are just
they're doing what they're told. Sources, NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration,
for sure. So the idea that a lot of these agencies were compromised, even at this isn't. It's so tough when you say, oh, everyone, it's a conspiracy. Everyone must have been in on it, right? But no, that's not usually how these things work. Like with the Manhattan Project, you had hundreds of thousands of people working together, but they were all pieces of different thing, and there was no interoperability there, which is why 9/11 stands out. It's because whoever ran this had access to everything at once, and basically said, we've cooed you here. So we've kind of already talked about this. This is Judy Wood's analysis. I'm going to zoom this back a little bit. There we go. About if you dropped a ball, here's 110 story World Trade Center. There's that number 11 again. And how long it would take for a ball to drop. And basically would be the pancake theory of all the floors collapsing against each other. We don't need to get into the details of this. You can read this on your own time. But what we didn't see was this. We didn't see this. We didn't see like the Seattle King Dome. We saw floors of rubble that remain there. What we saw was an absence of that. This is the opposite effect, right? We saw this motion of things disintegrating as it's falling. There wasn't this chain reaction. Even if you have bombs blowing up things or thermite pulverizing things, you're going to have some sort of resistance, and it's going to take longer than 10 seconds to go down. You can see, where's the stuff here? There's nothing fall. It's all out here. There's something wrong with these pictures. I'm just surprised that more structural engineer types haven't come out about this, and which is why I find suspect even groups like Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, who I think have noble intentions, run by Richard Gage, right? But they are loath to even entertain the notion that there was some sort of exotic technology going on here. I think that so much so that they are gatekeepers, essentially. Even the notion that bombs brought it down, I think, is part of misdirection government narrative. Not to say there weren't bombs in the building, but they certainly don't explain the magnetic readings, the lack of seismic readings, the toasted cars, all the other phenomena, the fuming of everything, right? We're seeing this weird, strange, this so much material is being injected at these fine particles. It doesn't look right. It doesn't look right. And if we saw a pancaking of floors, it should have taken maybe about 30 seconds at least for these buildings to come down, not 10 seconds. Not 10 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when you have a controlled demolition of a building, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but you have the charges, right, throughout the building, so that it does all fall at the same time. So that if the World Trade Centers, if they're falling, and I'm just thinking this through, without getting too far ahead in the discussion, because I'm actually just so you know, I'm watching. I decided to as a visual aid here. I'm watching a compilation of buildings being demolished. Okay, and these are what I'm watching here. They know. I mean, they have these are purposeful, right? And so when I'm watching the World Trade Centers, you're absolutely right. I mean, they do not.
It's getting destroyed from the top first.
Right. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Top first.
Uh-huh.
And
Anyhow,
this has
yeah,
how could the
continue.
ground
I'm sorry,
rumble
yeah.
for only 8 seconds while this
Yeah.
happened? All this dust that you see, it's covering. So the paper hit the ground first, and this dust must have come down second. Look how it's covering all this paper. All this was just hanging in the air, right? So we kind of need to come up with some new terms, I think, for what we're seeing here. Like shaving cream, right? Like this seems to be this is not smoke. It's not explosion effect. It's something else. It looks unusual. Here we have this wheat checks phenomenon here. I mean, these pictures are extraordinary. It's very lucky that we have all these documented. Even to put this presentation together, which comes a lot from her book, I had to go to her ancient dinosaur website hadn't been updated since maybe 2009, and a lot of it's broken links. So for the most part, when there's a government op to make you to lead you astray with a red herring or whatnot, they usually beat you over the head with it. Like the thermite thing and that Stephen Jones guy, I heard that everywhere, but you don't really see people really talking about this much, which means, I mean, the fact that I'm here talking with you and I was just interested in this, and I've done some research on it, but I'm by no means an expert in any of this. But I think that the lack of discussion is what is so striking about all this, right?
Yeah.
So here we see all this, what we would call dustification. I mean, look at this. Look at these plumes. These aren't from fires. This is not a fire that's happening. This is a turning of physical, or this is what I would think, more likely, the dustification of physical matter, essentially. We see these clouds that were rolling through Manhattan that cause interesting effects on the cars, which I get into later.
And I don't want to hijack your presentation, but I want to accentuate the point that you're making. All right, so I just paused just some random building collapse, right? And I keep in mind these are controlled, all right. And so, but just watch how the building stays together. In other words, you're demonstrating on 9/11 how the collapse is from the top, the pancaking effect, but this should be happening here the same way. But watch these buildings right here. Watch these. The buildings stay together
from the bottom. They're exactly. You see the top part go away first.
It's very it's bothersome.
It's not just the plane that would have done that, right? The plane caused whatever that weakened they'll say with the official story, but no, we see this weird fuming that was happening from the ground. Very strange. It's not hot because these people are not getting burnt by standing in it. They're standing in it and not like running away from it, right? Mm-hmm. These guys are looks like they're getting a little overwhelmed by some of this stuff, right? And then we have this other phenomenon of what we would call lathering up. This would be I believe this is building 7, where there was this effect of this lathering. It's way more than just smoke from fires. We saw this on all 3 buildings that eventually collapsed. This very fine dust, she calls nano dust. Some of the particles that they look at and they say, oh, this is thermite. Well, no, this is a breakdown molecularly of a lot of this material. Here's some more of this, what we call looming dissociated material. Poof, gone. It's just poofed. Here's more of this lathering up phenomenon where it starts from the top, and they'll say, oh, this is just fires. Well, no, there's no fires where some of this is happening. We're seeing some sort of almost microwaving of, for lack of a better term, this scalar torsion energy. Here's more of the smoke, and here we have it kind of oddly burns the vehicles, but not the paper. So it's just not a very hot thing. I mean, it's hot probably, but not conventionally hot. Here's some of the standing. And look at, where did all the material go? I mean, this, you could say, oh, there's a ton of debris here. This is not a ton of debris. This is a fraction of the debris. Here we have this shaving cream type fuming, right? This snowball effect of the collapse, this bubbling out. Like, what? This is not, you don't see this from a conventional demolition. Even a nuke would not do that, and especially not thermite. Two-tone color, bending over from the top breaks first. Very similar to what we call the Hutchison effect, which I will get to. Here is the remains of WTC1. This wild smoke. Sometimes it's black, sometimes it's white. It's this two-colored smoke. Two-colored, this gray and this white. These rolling clouds that coming through. They cover the parking lot, and they basically toast the cars as it passes through. And we have, not here, but later on, I have pictures of the but I mean, look at the amount of, these pictures are extraordinary, and it's very lucky that we have a lot of these. They're really important for this story. Wild. And these people were completely, obviously, covered in this, but it didn't kill anybody, right? At least it didn't burn anybody. There were no burns reported, I believe. Here we have some of these strangely burned cars. If you notice, these trees are doing just fine back here, but these cars are missing their engines and their door handles. in a lot of cases. When we've seen similar effects in some of the supposed direct energy weapon incidents, like in California, where you would have these cars that were essentially melted next to trees with leaves on them. Here we have the looming thing. And then I think, again, these people were got nailed by these clouds. These are not hot clouds, because this didn't kill any of these people. But boy, did it cover everybody, right? This guy is looking like he's not doing well. A lot of this toxic stuff, this was disassociated material. Here's all this paper on the ground.
It goes straight down to is just very curious, because another thing that I'm noticing with these
leaves on the tree,
even the controlled demolitions, where you are purposefully trying to keep them in a very tight footprint. I'm just watching collapse after collapse, and none of these controlled demolitions that everyone knows are on purpose. None of them are staying as tight as a building that is that tall. In other words, I'm watching buildings that are, maybe a tenth of the size of the World Trade Center towers, and it's a controlled demolition, and they're not staying in that footprint. This right here is 10 times higher than the buildings that I'm watching these
look at this material
stuff. And these are going straight down at 110 stories. That's curious in of itself.
This is pulverized. This is not just smoke, right? This is another phenomenon here. This is a massive amount of material, a massive cloud. It's huge, right? And all this stuff is fuming up from the ground. Now, here's the fuming. I think this is can't remember, one of the buildings, maybe building 6. Building 3, W Trade Center 3 is basically just gone. Fuming up. Toasted a lot. They went through these cars, and then they messed them up. So I think this is kind of the end of this part of all the strange. This is not hot. People are walking. All the paper has not burnt, but cars have been totally toasted. And we've scrubbed the sidewalk. So here is something very important. You'll notice in the few days after 9/11, actually for the weeks and months and even years, but especially the first few days, they started dumping piles of dirt onto the scene. And we have pictures of them loading truckload by truckload by truckload. They just fill these with dirt and pouring it over everything, and then pulling that dirt out and repeating the process again and again. We see it. It's been dumped on top of a lot of this stuff. Dirt dumped up here. They're dumping dirt, and this is not rubble. They were actually bringing it in and covering up. Some of these pictures are pretty insane. They were covering. There's dirt. They're dumping dirt onto this. Why were they doing that? Well, the idea is there was some sort of, why more than 2 weeks later is the dirt pile in front of the former WTC3 bigger? So they keep bringing in these trucks. There was some sort of ongoing reaction happening. Look at more dirt they're piling on top of here. A lot of these we're seeing instant rustification on these beams. This is not fire caused. This is some sort of molecular transformation that we also saw in the cars, the toasted cars, where certain parts of them were being toasted. Again, it's a term that's not necessarily heat, but their molecular composition has been changed. Here we have, they're putting dirt. You see this. This is dirt that they're dumping on this. This is not debris. These are truckloads of dirt. Clean, new, wrinkled beams get dirt dumped on them. It's very strange. Freshly dumped dirt. And here are the trucks coming in with massive amounts of dirt. And they would dump it and they would leave. Very strange. So whoever appeared to be dirt, and now they're pulling it away. This is more dirt. So whoever was doing this was mitigating, according to this theory, an ongoing reaction that was happening in the rubble, the material here. And that reaction continued for years. These holes in the windows are also very important. This is the WFC, is a nearby building. They piled dirt on it. So here you have the pre-shot. A couple days later, fresh dirt. They're piling dirt on all these locations. Why? Yellow bulldozers appear to be scooping up and removing all the dirt in front of the building. It's a massive task that they've been given. The fuming, it still comes covered in wet dirt. They're piling it on here. The fuming is continuing. They're trying to mitigate it. The reaction, whatever chemically is happening there, they are trying to mitigate it essentially. Here we have water here. There's tales of, oh, there was pools of molten metal. Well, there wasn't really. There was hot looking things, but they weren't exactly hot. They were glowing with a different type of energy. Pools of water they're doing just fine here. They're still hosing down the pile a year later, hosing it down. It's still fuming. This is a year later, and they're still putting dirt on it. Like, what are they doing here? This whole process was a year, at least, of them doing that. Here we are. We're doing the lathering up thing. Smoke rings coming out. So I encourage people to look through all these pictures and what they might imply. They're pretty extraordinary and intense and breathtaking. Like, this is a fire. This is something is happening here to this building. It's not a conventional fire. It's being dissociated in front of us, basically. Boom, boom, boom. Once upon a time, there was a building called WTC7, Building 7, and then it went away. This would have been the tallest building in 33 different states. It was a massive skyscraper, and it just disappeared. So here it is, boom, here it is here. It's just gone. It didn't, like you saw in those conventional things, it didn't collapse like you would see. It didn't really affect that much around it.
Right, and the official narrative is that that the two towers obviously were hit by planes. The steel melts and it falls down on itself, as opposed to these videos that I've been watching here where they've had controlled demolitions. And again, to reiterate the point, those controlled demolitions had triggered charges in them and didn't fall nice and neat like they were supposed to in most of these cases that I'm watching, compared to what we just witnessed with 9/11.
There's a reason why the 9/11 Commission, which was just a whitewash disaster, travesty, they don't even mention Building 7 because it's so out there, and they're afraid to touch it essentially.
Because remember my Charlie board. Remember this.
Yes.
Because if you can get from the official narrative to start questioning World Trade Center 7,
well, no plane,
then that's a gateway to these other things, what the government knew.
I've seen it suggested that maybe that plane that went down or was shot down, whatever you want to say, in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, perhaps was meant to hit something was meant to hit WTC 7, because the fact that they had a third building go down in the same way and they had to ignore it completely means that something kind of went wrong, with respect to that. So I could see that fourth plane maybe had been meant for that, because having 3 planes hit 3 buildings and those 3 collapse, you can convince a lot of normies about that. And a lot of people are convinced by that to this day. But having 2 planes take down 3 buildings is a little bit too much. So you have this fourth plane that, where was it going to go? The plans were ruined. So here we have a bus that has been, let me look at the damage here, but look at this tree with the leaves just doing fine right next to it, right? These leaves are all intact. Here's that Building 7. Of course, the trees are doing good.
Yeah.
But there appears to be more debris or
Yeah,
the building
pause that right
7.
there. Yeah, pause that for just a moment, because the bus there in that shot is decimated and looks scorched. But like you
Yes.
said, the leaves on the tree is fine. God
The
almighty.
leads on the tree are fine. And we see this phenomenon again and again.
So what do we
Um,
attribute that to that, or am I getting ahead?
well, again, I don't understand. I'm not trying to say these are the physics of
Right.
exactly what has happened,
Yep.
but I'm trying to say, look at this anomaly. It's similar to
Something's
all these.
inconsistent here.
Something is inconsistent with this energy that we are seeing, right? Here's where the building 7 was. There's more debris uh, than the World Trade Center, but we do have dirt they're putting dirt on it as well. Okay. They're still doing the dirt thing, which is so strange, but I think very important. More dirt piles. This is not, we saw them dumping it on. This is not just rubble, right? Now, here we have the toasted cars. These cars were up to a mile away. And some of them are missing seatbelts, door handles, their engines, their wheels appear strangely burnt.
And we
But
can't say, oh, that's interesting. Before you mentioned the tires being burnt, I was going to say, we can't say it was the shock wave because we've already established that the shock wave was minimal.
That's right. These were not moved to this position. These were observed where they are, and very inconsistent next to other vehicles that seem to be doing just fine. You can see that they look toasted, and some of them show strange rusting phenomenons where they're not being burnt in conventional ways.
I could
Okay?
understand dust being all over the place, maybe being buried under debris that blew that way, but these are scorched.
Yes, something, but not consistently, right? The back of this
Right. Yeah.
appeared to,
Yeah.
and then something moved this car on top of this car, and look at it did to the
Wow.
wheel. So this is found, and I love this picture. I love this picture. So look what happened to this car. Look at this car.
There we go.
That is a blue van. And this
Hashtag
is even kind of
Valley.
blue. And this has kind of escaped as much damage as well. But this is so striking to me. And you have
Yeah.
this just melted vehicles, right? What happened to these vehicles? Why is this way, but not the ones next to it? It's inconsistent. The damage is inconsistent. It's like it peeled away. Here, very strange. Peeling away of this paint, rusting, not really consistent with the melted doors, not like a fire. The engine is gone here, but
Because remember now, let's just keep reminding everyone that a lot of this damage is a mile away, but yet the towers came straight down. And if you are being affected by the residuals coming out from underneath it, fine, you've got a lot of dust. Maybe you even have some debris kicking out. But doesn't explain.
Look, it's going for the engine blocks, but not necessarily the gasoline fuel tanks, right? So there's something about the engine, these engines that are attracting. Look at all this paper, the destruction of this, the amount of burning that must have happened to cause this, or conventional burning, doesn't jive with all. How did this car get turned upside down? Now we've seen similar effects during hurricanes, which they create these torsion field effects that cause matter to do weird stuff. FDR Drive, all these cars, bizarre. The steel belts from the tires are still on them, but look at this. Very important story. Key to this, the nukes won't explain, the thermite won't explain. Look at this blue fire extinguisher seem to do okay, but the rest of things not so much.
Yeah, well, hold on, that's very important actually.
Yeah.
Hold on a second here. Okay, it's sitting in the middle of items that are clearly scorched, for lack of a better word.
Yes.
what's and maybe that piece of paper, I don't know what that did. Did that blow in there?
Who knows?
Yeah, that
The
that's
amount of destruction on these cars, it looks like they've been aged, not just burnt. They've been aged, toasted, toasted. What happened to these guys? Here we are. So here we are. We are now
here we
next the
are.
next phase here. So
So let me
and
ask you. Let me ask you that. Right,
yeah,
I'm. You're driving the
yeah,
boat
yeah.
here. Okay. Do you
I can
want to
sort of start to
pause
wrap.
here?
What's that?
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to ask you. Did you want to move on
No,
to?
no, no. I think I can sort of put a bow on this and like skip through the rest of this here, and people
Okay.
can
Okay.
just because I, I think that I can identify the origin of the power that might be needed to now the means that would be used to redirect, like that is not, that's beyond the scope of my what I'm talking about. But when I
Well, hold on
hear
before
that,
before you poo poo that. The U.S. government has been controlling the weather, admittedly, to one degree or another since the 1940s. So that would put 60 years of working on this. I wanted to set that stage
for
before
sure.
you went
And I've
on.
already sort of mentioned that how governments have been admitting that they've been doing this for a while. So I would encourage people to come to the Substack where you can play these videos because
Yeah.
they start to get pretty interesting. But it kind of shows how big this thing was and how little the news was talking about it, which is so strange. Basically, this comparable in size to Katrina. Um, but here it is. I mean, look at this. There's New York. I mean, this is a huge storm, right? And you can see how it
What
came along like
what
this.
is happening there?
It parked itself here and then it pieced out. And there's a better one that shows.
Now, it did have a massive cold front that came through there, but the key is that when you're a weather forecaster, it's just like anything in media. You just are spoon fed information. This is the narrative. You
Look,
rip and you
it
read.
says rough cells over here.
Rough cells.
That's all
So
it
I mean,
says.
so you have to go back to a thing you mentioned earlier about all these individual compartments within the government, and if NOAA is delivering, because that's what, when you're waiting on a hurricane, you're waiting for the next report. It comes out at,
Look
I
how
forget,
close this is
10,
here.
6. Right. And so you're reading what the authority, where we've heard that before, the government authority tells you, hey, here's what's going to happen. So anyway, and that becomes everyone's forecast.
So this sort of follows the trajectory of it. And then you can see on there it is. There's the 11 there. On 9/11, it was closest to New York, and so close that all of the warning things should have gone. According to Hurricane Aaron entered the response zone. Hurricane in this zone should presumably trigger a response. There was no response. There was no alert given. It was very quiet. Okay. So the idea is that this could have been steered into place and somehow using the HARP type technology tapped into the immense amount of power that hurricane would be generating to use that energy to essentially dissociate the matter of the. I mean, I hope I'm getting that right. I mean, that's just my idea, my general like idea of how what would have happened here. And getting into the field effects from hurricanes, you see these strange. This is not, this is another hurricane, right, from 1992, where people would say, oh, it's so powerful that it clearly it caused this effect. Well, some of the things that have been observed in hurricanes go beyond they look like essentially a fusing of matter. I'm not saying it's literal X-Files, Bermuda Triangle stuff here, but the field effects that we've observed in hurricanes show some pretty unusual stuff, like straws that basically can get put into wood, cars doing unusual things, being lifted, similar to what we saw, how cars were flipped over on 9/11 that shouldn't have been flipped over, right? Again, people would say, oh, they're just strong hurricanes. Well, no, could be something else happening here with how matter is reacting to these torsion energy fields, essentially. See, here we have a supercell and a Tesla coil, right? So there's a whole idea of what hurricanes actually and how, here are magnetic anomalies as well on 9/11. So these are all different stations that picked up something unusual happened on September 11th. And here we're following Hurricane Aaron and how it hit. Here's the different magnetometer readings that show something very strange happened. So the Hutchison effect.
So hold on a second there. And maybe you're about to get to this. So let me write that down. I'll ask my question after you talk about the Hutchinson effect.
Well, it's not much to say other than he's a dude who started doing these Tesla type. He took Tesla, some of his ideas, and started doing these, working with what he would call field effects, using frequency electrostatic stuff, and was able to cause weird stuff with weird fires without heat, bent beams he would cause, weird ongoing reactions, kind of like what we saw after 9/11, a transmutation at the molecular level, which they say thermite would cause, but actually would be caused by these effects. So he would see basically forks fuse into other metal in ways. Some people, you might be familiar with the Philadelphia experiment, which happened in the 40s.
Yes, which that's a future program conversation topic.
Nice. Yeah. So basically they tried to make a thing, a battleship invisible, and using Tesla technology and cloaking and whatnot. And there's all sorts of old wives' tales that happen around that since it was so long ago. But one of them is that essentially they transported it or made it disappear. And then when it came back, sailors were fused into the wall, to actual part of the ship. And like basically a whole weird molecular thing happened. So that's all, unconfirmed speculation. But so you see Hutchinson was able to do stuff like this. Now, people will say, oh, he's a hoaxer, he's been proven frauds. Well, no. Governments, especially the Canadian government, went in and Boeing or some Raytheon, I can't remember. One of our things, I was very interested in his work. A lot of it's tricky because it can't be replicated under certain, it's tough to replicate. Like you have to get everything just right. So there's clearly some other energy system that's tapping into. But look at, we saw a bending of the beams. This is a Hutchison effect. This is 9/11. A lot of this weird jellification of material. We saw that this is more than just getting bent by weight. This is a shriveling effect, metal being literally shriveled. And the holes are important too, because we saw these in a lot of the metal. So this is a Hutchison effect where he was able to do this to a can here. And by the way, the guy who's doing this in the 80s said, indeed, he thinks that this was a big example of his effect, 9/11, especially the fuming that he was asked about, the fuming that came out of the ground, the weird things for years. He said that is part of my experience with my experiments. All these string-like effects, these bending of beams, the rustification of them are so strange. Hutchison noticed this similar fast aging effect, rustification. See, here we are, rustification of these cars, toasty aluminum. Look at this. You can see the rust already starting. These strange circular holes in nearby buildings are very important. Localized fires. The firefighters walking in the fire instead of around it. It's not a hot fire. It's not burning this paper. The dude's walking in it. What's up with that? And that Hutchison reported he's choosing to walk through the fire. Maybe this area is also hot, but in a different way. Maybe it's like less hot. It doesn't really jive what we're seeing here with this burning. I mean, these pictures are a lot of these, or at least one that I know, photographer that took some of these pictures lost his life. So a lot of these pictures are sacrificed that we're even able to look at them. But look at this paper next to this burning vehicle. Trees, paper, these are key pictures. Look at this. Look at this. What is it picking up? The hydraulic system of this machine should be overheating. This is not a high heat object that it's picking up, okay? Cars upside down. How are they flipped? John Hutchison observed anti-gravity. What are we talking about? Thomas Townsend Brown. Some of these combining electricity with magnetism, creating a local gravitational effect that includes lifting. All right. On the ongoing reaction. As of 2007, they were still dumping dirt in. Years after, this is from a year later, it's still fuming. You can see this dirt is fuming coming from this is a chemical reaction that's happening. Fuming. September 2006, 5 years later, fuming. This is a reaction happening here. They are constantly having to mitigate this and deal with this, which is crazy. All this dirt they're bringing in. 2007, fresh dirt. They're still 6 years later dumping dirt on it. Look at 2007, fresh pile of dirt. They're not doing reconstruction here. They're fixing things, right? But they're also, if this is where the construction for the foundation of a new building, what is the dirt for? They removed it 3 days later. Dirt pile's gone. So we have all these pictures. They're hosing each other down. They're wearing hazmat suits. Why is he wearing a hazmat suit 6 years later? All right. So we can sort of skip through this so we can get to the end here. Bankers, look at this, starting to rust already. No rust here. Weird. Look at this thing. It's so strange. It's like it curled up. It's not a high heat reaction there. Holes in them. This is a Hutchison effect example here. Hutchison effect. Look at how it's a similar thing we're seeing here. This is a striking comparison between the Hutchison effect. The only filing cabinet found in all of the records was this shriveled up little thing mass. Here's a fused block of debris. So it causes a fusing of this. So here's a Hutchison effect sample of a knife that basically fused itself into aluminum. See this fusing of materials. Here's another Hutchison effect of wood that fused itself into aluminum. This paper is wild. What happened here? What happened to this stuff? Look at this hole. Hutchison effect. Look at this hole. This is a nearby building. This is building 6, which was fully destroyed. I mean, mostly, but it had this strange hole in it. I mean, look at that. Look at that. Material is like missing from all of this, right? Where did all the material go? And here there's these holes. Here's a Hutchison effect. Here's a bending, that similar bending that we saw. Hutchison effect, weird rusting. Where did the material go? And then talking about their oxygen bottles are going up, they're exploding, but they're not being burnt. They're hearing all the firefighters are talking about their equipment exploding essentially. What caused the steel to rust? These holes. Steel beam as thin as toilet paper. Now, these are all Hutchison effect samples, which is pretty amazing. So this is all the stuff that he's done. And don't these look like broken twin towers to you? They look like it to me. Like this looks like the tower collapsing. The way that it splits near the top, and the top is bent first before the rest of it. And finally, we get to the end here, which is the fact that we've been dealing with this technology for a long time. The Department of Defense admits they've been experimenting with the directed energy weaponry. Why didn't the bathtub get damaged? Look, these are all the train stations underneath. They weren't destroyed. They should have been. 500,000 tons. The bathtub survived. The trains mostly survived. The mall underneath survived. Our friends, the Warner Brothers, Bugs Bunny, they survived. Earthquake. So yeah, I was wrong. I said 3 earlier. They were 2.3 and 2.1 on the Richter scale. They should have been at least 3, maybe 3.8. They should have been an order of magnitude higher than what came down. Here's the King Dome. This is what the King Dome looked like. All that debris all piled up. It produced a higher seismic reaction despite having 1/10 of the material. We have in here all the seismic recording stations. They won't give us the data from most of them. We don't have the data from. So all these should have seismic recordings, but they won't give it to us. Someone should freedom of information them. But we do have it for the King Dome. It was not in the bedrock. Should have been way higher. And yeah, so then finally, I think I want to just see buildings turning to dust. This is a great one. This is known as the spire. Look at this. So it's like here, and then it's not. The spire. This is on 9/11. You can
No, hold
watch it
on.
happen.
You got to keep that there.
Wait, hold on.
That,
Here it is in real time, though. Here it is in real time. There's the spire. Watch it goes. Watch what happens. It's still there. It's gone. It's gone before it even falls.
that right there, that right there is the most damning thing we've seen all day.
I think you might be right. I mean, this is well known as the spire.
Look at that. I have never seen that ever. It just vanished. It didn't fall to the ground and get, because you could convince someone and you could say, yeah, it all turned to dust, guys, because of all the weight that was coming down. And someone could possibly believe that.
Boom, there's
that
the moment.
Here isn't being buried by anything.
It's gone. It's there and it's not. And this is really hard to see, but it's a similar turning to dust thing that's happening. It's basically dissolving into powder.
It's like, you know what that is? That's like on the Avengers, you know? Like when Thanos snaps, and that's what happened to that spire. Thanos snapped and it just went poof. What the hell's happening there? I can't
the photographer that took this died like right after this. I think this was his last picture, but you're seeing this massive chunk out of the building here. It's wild. It's wild here. So
gosh, man.
Not hot. He's walking through it. There's all the dust. All this dust wafting forward. Now, here's this guy. This guy survived. The people that got covered with this, so it wasn't hot. This dust cloud comes in.
That's important. I want you to make your point there, but I want to point out that guy you said survived. It wasn't hot, yet we just saw all the cars around there that were melted.
And can lead me to the jumpers, which I said I would mention. Yeah. And we can see all the holes. Like that's such a strange hole right there. These strange things. There's weird holes, similar to what we saw with the Hutchison effect. Again, I could spend hours just talking through these, but please come and check them out. There's the holes. So we have all these people that
this entire report that he's scrolling through right there at the bottom, foundring.substack.com. Get there. Good grief.
There's the fuming there. And they're underneath this. All this should not be there. This wall was not crushed. You can see this is a great picture. This is the amount of fire that here, but we have all this paper here. So strange. So strange. It's a very selective fire next to the trees there. Why doesn't the paper burn? So we have everyone running around on the ground, get covered with dust, but there aren't any burnings. So this is a very interesting phenomenon here with this. Sorry, I'm going through this so fast, but there's a lot of images here. The fire starts to burn the vehicles, but not any of the paper. The smoke cloud comes through, catches these guys on fire, and then the paper's all still there. It toasts these cars. And then 10 days later, you can see the rust. The rust is forming. A lot of rust. And they start getting rid of these cars. They have the strangest rusting. It's like an ongoing reaction that's happening to these vehicles. So here's shows that here's the seismic signature. You got a lot of heat there. 12 days later, heat's gone. There's all these talks about molten piles of metal. The seismic signature does not, sorry, I said seismic. The thermal signature, not the seismic, the thermal signature does not show any of that. So we could not have had the molten metal. In fact, the people that were pushing the molten metal were people like Stephen Jones. And this is a good way to sort of wrap things up here. For example, he came out and he's a government agent and discredited the work of Pons and Fleischmann, who were the cold fusion guys from the early 90s or 89, 90, and they came out. It's a little before my time, but they came out and said, oh, we've done cold fusion. And they actually, the evidence has now come out since then. They've reproduced their studies, and they actually were onto something, right, with the whole cold fusion thing, but they were just totally discredited, and the press came out. Well, why? They were forced to come out with their findings earlier because this dude, Stephen Jones, who admits to having a connection with the 9/11, with the Department of Energy, got tipped off by the Department of Energy, his government informants essentially, and came out with the cold fusion. He said, oh, I did it too. And he was lying. And it ended up, they used him, it forced Pons and Fleischman to come out early. I know this sounds like, why are you talking about this? No, this is important. And they allowed themselves to present, they forced them to present their findings before they were done with them, and allowed the media to discredit them. And this guy was the single guy behind it. In fact, they made an entire movie about it called Heavy Watergate, about how they were discredited. And it was Stephen Jones who had his Department of Energy informants that covered up this technology. So who is he? He's the guy that came out and said, oh, it's thermite. This random professor, like, what? Okay. And he started doctoring images. He doctored this image, and he made it seem like this was hot fire, that he says this is thermite caused this. This is the real image. There was not a yellow glow. He did the same thing here, where he took this image and he added these weird light charges things, and he said this was thermite. So he was basically doctoring images and lying and connected with the government. So this dude is lying. And again, I don't think that this means that we throw out the thermite thing completely. But again, thermite does not explain the toasted cars, the magnetic stuff, all that stuff. And same thing with Richard Gage. These guys are, and the 9/11 Truth are kind of the gatekeeper type. So if you want to come here and watch these things on it. So to sort of wrap this up again, I know I've said that. I want to just say that the jumpers, I think, tell a story. And there are, in this book, there are many pictures of them. A huge number of people, and God rest their souls, jumped. We're talking, the estimates are hard to say. And it's a tough topic for some people. It's pretty intense, but maybe upwards of 1,000 or more.
Wow.
There are times when the firefighters said it was 1 in every 1 and 2 seconds people were landing. Okay. So I know this is, people will say, oh, well, you're in a burning. It takes more than a burning building to cause that many people to jump out of a building, right? I know it's like hard to put yourself in that position, right? But what we're seeing with the jumpers is some unusual phenomenon where many of them are almost like they're being projected. Many of them are so far out of the building that they appear to have been launched out. And perhaps the most important part is many of them can be seen disrobing, either in the air or on the side of the building. They are taking their pants off. They are taking their shirts off. They are in a state of undress. Now, we know from the people that were there in the building that the fire extinguishers, of course, were going off. Everyone was soaking wet. Now, that's done. If you are wet and you are around a fire, that's good. You have a little bit of insulation. You're not going to spontaneously combust, in other words, right? The wetness protects you from the fire. But what we saw was a lot of people taking off their clothes and just jumping into certain death, right? Like standing there and dealing with a burning building is bad. And sure, maybe there would be some people that would say, oh, I'm just going to jump, but the amount of people that chose that option is way too high. If you catch like that I'm doing suicide right now is more indicative of they were escaping something that was far worse than the death, than an imminent death. Are you catching my drift? Mm-hmm. So what is suggested is that, especially the people that were in whatever focal zone was, maybe right where that tower split, was this direct energy weapon was basically hitting them. And especially if you were soaking wet, it would have a microwave effect on you, and it would be awful. I mean, that's what microwaves do. They heat up the water, right? That's how you heat up food in a microwave. So instead of the water providing you protection from the heat of a fire, what it was doing was it was causing unimaginable agony to these people. They were essentially being toasted alive, like what we saw, but in a different phenomenon than fire heat. So these jumpers tell a story, an important one. They are showing us that something was happening to them, that they would rather get splatted, sorry to put it that way, than stay in that building where there was at least a chance of escape or rescue. Now, you could say, oh, if there was only 1 or 2 or 3 that did that, I'd be like, oh, this was hundreds of people that made this decision. So
do we know how, I would love to know the timeline on the jumpers exactly. And I guess
obviously before the towers collapsed, right?
Right, but I'm wondering how long this happened. In other words, let's say a direct energy weapon was involved.
Right.
How long would that have been concentrated on?
Well, so the eyewitness reports are in this book, and I would have to read through them again, but they do describe how the firemen say at first it was 1 in every 30 seconds, and then it was 1 in every 10, and then by the end it was once every 1 or 2 seconds that they were hearing the sounds.
But do you know off the top of your head how long that was happening?
I don't.
In other words, what'd you say?
It was a period over a few minutes, I would think, because they reported, oh, it was 1 every 30 seconds. So you would need a few minutes to sort of get that, if that makes sense.
So yes, kind of, in other words, if a direct energy weapon is involved in the destruction of the towers, that energy wasn't just a 1 second and now here comes a tower. You're saying it would be building up, building up, building up. Yes. Which could be commensurate with.
Well, that's what we saw with the lathering up. With the lathering up, it was disassociating the material first to create the necessary conditions so that the towers essentially could just be brought down in the way that they were. But it had to build it up first. And yes, the question is maybe it was started right after the quote unquote planes hit, right? Because there's discussion about that, and then here I'll leave you with a cliffhanger with a final book that I will bring up today, and is this one. It's called The Most Dangerous Book in the World, 9/11 as Mass Ritual, by this guy S.K. Bain. And I read this in 2012, so this was a while ago. But it basically talks about how all the numbers of the flights, and then you might say, oh, you're just being a schizo numerology person. Well, no, I'm a Scrabble guy. I know my patterns. That's why we had to put my credentials out, my nerd schizo credentials. But no, there are certain things about these planes, the numbers of the planes. Flight 11 was the first to hit. Flight 77. Why 77 is important? Why flight 77 hit the Pentagon, which was 77 feet high on the 77th meridian west. And Grandpa Bush was 77 years old. And then the plane flying above was Venus 77. So there's all these numbers that are connected in a way that this has a ritualistic nature to this event. In particular, the infamous, notorious occultist Aleister Crowley, who lived at the turn of the century. There's some fun, not even remotely proven speculation that he might be the father of Barbara Bush, because he was friends with Barbara Bush's mom. And Barbara Bush, of course, married George Bush and had George W. Bush, so the mother. So he was doing these weird sex rituals, and he was all about numbers. And I know this sounds like I might be losing some people here, but but no, it's like all these. Let me just put it this way: you don't have to believe in the occult, numerology, that kind of stuff. Right. They kind of do, right? That doesn't mean if you don't believe in it, but they like to do this kind of thing, and they like to, for karmic purposes, maybe put these numbers in these rituals. So even 9/11. All these 11s. And like I said, Daddy Bush gave the 9/11 speech 11 years before. And, again, you lose people when you say, they're like, okay, fine. These are just coincidences. Well, no, they're indications of these layers where you have the terrorists, low guys putting the bombs in the buildings, and even the the CIA agents or the Mossad agents, right? Because everyone talks about the dancing Israelis that were there to document. Sure, I get that. There are these elements, but there are higher levels. So who is wielding this technology, right? So that gets to the who here. And is it a nation state? Is it a China? Is it a Russia? Is it an Israel? Is it our own government? I would say no to all of those. I could say criminal elements of all of those are involved in all this nonsense, but I think we're dealing with what we call a breakaway civilization. Richard Dolan talks about it, a few other researchers, and that especially since World War II, post World War II, there has been this entity that is operating outside of the sovereignty of a nation state and is pulling a lot of this stuff, not to absolve the Chinese or whoever might have been involved in our government, but I think that some of them were caught surprised. I don't think that Cheney maybe knew that the direct energy weapons would be used. Maybe he did. I'll grant that, but I don't think that he was the one with the button. I think this was what we would call a breakaway civilization, a term that can mean a lot of different things, but essentially they have their own system of finance, which I've done some research on about. They have their own bearer bonds type whole thing. That's another can of worms. They have their own system of finance and they have their own system of technology. When all that stuff, the Tesla stuff, the T.T. Brown, Thomas Townsend Brown stuff, the electrogravitics, all this stuff went dark about 60, 70 years ago. And then what do we see? Kennedy assassination, Vietnam War, all these wars that were basically using the military industrial complex of the United States, which is what Eisenhower warned about, for their purpose. And I think that we see elements of a post-Nazi fascist group there. I think there's elements of, we can talk about, the Jesuits and the Zionists and all that stuff. Sure. But there is a group of these folks that are basically using events like 9/11 as blackmail. Like the US government, at least the traditional part of it, was essentially blackmailed into doing those wars. And then we saw 2008 financial crisis, and then we're still seeing them fight to this day. And I think the good news is they're not completely running things, or we would be you and I wouldn't even be having this conversation, right? There's clearly a power structure that is at play here. There's infighting between, and there's not necessarily good guys and bad guys. There's a lot of douchebags, I think, that are been fighting, and maybe they've been doing this for thousands of years. I mean, you know better than most about all that. So yeah, I think there's a lot of questions that still need to be asked, but really we need to talk about this technology. What is it? Who's got it? And who's in charge of stuff right now? All this
and
stuff.
how far has it advanced in 23 years if it was indeed used on 9/11?
Oh, for sure. So this was a debut on a global scale and saying, hey, look at what we can do. So for the people that were kind of knowing, they knew what they were seeing on 9/11. They were seeing a technology, and that doesn't necessarily mean, oh, we know exactly what this was. This was a beam from HARP or whatever. Scalar, torsion waves, or like whatever. This is something, and it may be similar to stuff that we've used in civilizations for thousands of years. So the Great Pyramid complex at Giza has elements to the ability to manipulate weather, to create power, to even be used as a weapon. There is a site in the Pacific called Nan-Madol, Nanmadol, and is called the eighth wonder of the world. It's essentially in the middle of nowhere, thousands of miles away from another island. It's a series of basically man-made constructed islands with some tunnels, a network of tunnels underneath them, filled with electric eel carcasses. And essentially this was so this was electric. It was basically a giant computer. And it was right in the Pacific where hurricanes form, right in that spot. And it was speculated that it was essentially a giant hurricane mitigation machine, because that hurricane was about, it's called Nan-Madol, N-A-N, new word, M-A-D-O-L. Okay. The speculation is that the hurricanes that formed there basically hit the Philippines. And on the Philippines, we see these giant rice flats that are considered to be a weird phenomenon, because they basically built mountains to grow massive amounts of rice. But the amount of engineering and the amount of rice that it would produce far by an order of magnitude surpassed the population has ever been on the Philippines. So the idea was that this was a location used to be the breadbasket for a larger civilization, a Lemuria or Atlantis type older civilization that basically built this machine to steer or to control the hurricanes and mitigate them and steer them away from their breadbasket where they were trying to grow all their food, so they wouldn't get all flooded and they lose their food. So I get that that's like what kind of the speculation, but my point is that we have been using various means to manipulate the weather, and perhaps the high civilizations that existed before were using that as well. And what we're seeing is sort of the modern version of that, and we see the weather warfare, and maybe countries are using energy weapons or I should say earthquake weapons at each other. Like talk about, oh, maybe the Haiti earthquake was and the Fukushima thing, all these, and the one, what was it in the east, the Indies, so the one that caused the tsunami, I think it was like 2007 or so. So all of these are precipitated with weird atmospheric anomalies that they're like with the Fukushima one in 2011, that the sky heated up for several days before, and they're like, oh, what a weird coincidence. Well, there might be something to that, to these governments. I will end with this. The first memory that I have, I was 3 years old, was the 1989 earthquake in California called the Loma Prieta earthquake. And it was a devastating earthquake, killed a bunch of people. But there are weird anomalies that were picked up, ultra low frequency magnetic anomalies picked up in the hours leading before that event. So people might say, oh, well, this could be just a natural weird thing that we don't understand, or evidence of a technology that was being used. Like that was, the Soviets were still around then. Us and them were throwing scalar weapons at each other all throughout the 70s and 80s, potentially, according to some of these researchers. So, man, you got the whole thing. I got like, wham, bam, thank you, man.
Look at that. We got there. But
we did
I do want to throw up this this book recommendation. This sounds like another episode all on its own. The Barbara Bush, Aleister Crowley connection is also referenced in the book One Nation Under Blackmail, Volume 1, The Sordid Union Between Intelligence and Crime That Gave Rise to Jeffrey Epstein. Wow.
Well, it's so much more than that. So, yes, that is a whole nother thing. But so Crowley, it wasn't just so he influenced the NASA folks. So he was really close with Jack Parsons, who basically ran the Jet Propulsion Lab, and they were doing Crowleyan sex rituals in there. Like, so NASA was basically founded. This is Richard Hoagland says this, by Nazis with the Werner von Braun guys, Freemasons, they were all Freemasons, and magicians, the Jack Parsons types. And they were buddies with L. Ron Hubbard, who was and ended up founding Scientology, the science fiction guy. So all these were connected. And then, yes, with the Epstein thing, and even Ghislaine Maxwell and her sisters wrote software used by the U.S. government back in the 90s, early 2000s. It was her sisters that used a lot of this for the security networks. And this goes back to this PROMIS software, PROMIS, that may have been used as a back end to basically infiltrate all these government agencies. So yes, the Ghislaine Maxwell, the Jeffrey Epstein, the Mossad connection is there. But this is, again, Hydra. Bigger than, yes, this is way bigger thing. It's a Hydra. This, what was it? The octopus, was it Danny Castellero, the guy who got shot the back of the head twice? He was looking up suicided in the back of the head twice. Yeah. Gary Webb's and all those folk that start to get too close to the thing. But me, I'm just a ragtime piano player. Don't come for me. I'm a Scrabble nerd. I'm not serious.
Yeah. Well, man, I am grateful for your presentation, and I don't think it's the last time that we're going to be discussing September 11th, 2001 on this show here at the Mike Deep Dive. A lot of you, when I put out a call, I don't know, not that long ago, asking for anybody that you listen to as far as 9/11 goes, and I got a lot of great suggestions. I saw them, and I appreciate all of you that reached out, whether publicly or privately, and I've taken note. And
hopefully they didn't call me too many mean names, though. I don't really care.
No one has said anything negative about you that I've seen. And I will say, though, of all of this 2.5 hour discussion that we've had today, that vanishing that spire being
Yeah, I love it.
Thanos is that's mind blowing. That makes no sense at all. Why? And if you didn't see it, if you're just tuning in, um, the spire just vanishes on its way down. It just disintegrates, which makes no sense because there was nothing falling down on that. There's so much here, and we'll never know 100% of the truth of this thing. And you've presented a very compelling case here, and I'm telling you, man, if only 20% of your presentation is accurate, it's still mind blowing.
For sure.
And I appreciate your time. If you guys want to share this, this whole presentation that he went through, it's available there at foundring.substack.com. And of course, also be sure to follow him over on X
Yeah,
at
and I have all my
Foundring1.
videos are up on Rumble now since I got
Yes,
banned from
because
YouTube.
yeah, that's how I was introduced to you, was just through your talent with the piano and your awesome song lyrics, all of your songs there, and people need to check out. You got a lot of stuff there, and do your digging on your own. If you're watching this right now, please share this video with your friends and family, and they may have another piece to this puzzle. But as I said at the onset, we're Americans, and it's our birthright to ask questions, demand answers from our government when something doesn't make sense. And we're never going to get the full truth from our government, and so we have to keep on bugging them. But I want to thank you for joining me today, and all of you that have tuned in and have participated in the chat. Very grateful for you. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern, we get to hang out with Garrett O'Boyle and Stephen Friend, two FBI whistleblowers, but I'm taking them out of their element of serious talk, and we're going to have some fun and watch animal videos together. And then I'm off for 2 weeks. I'll be traveling, but then when I come back, we got all sorts of fun stuff for you. We can talk about the FBI. We can talk about Alaska. We got more election integrity issues that we need to discuss, and some fun guests as well. So every Tuesday and Friday, right here, 2 p.m. Eastern. And we'll see you guys tomorrow. Thanks again, buddy. I appreciate you making time, Foundry.
Hey, it's my absolute my pleasure. Thank you. Let's do it again sometime for sure.
You bet. We will. Absolutely. Take care.